Hello again, welcome. This is the third video and the last one in the short series that we're doing for our crowdfunding program. And it's going to be on burns, but I'm going to have to rewind for a second because I blew it in the last video where we talked about movement phases, and I don't think I explained something clearly. So let me jump in and explain that to you real quick. We talked in the last video about empowered and defenseless pieces, okay? You can capture pieces and get points through burns, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But during the regular movement phase, you can also gain points and capture pieces. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. All right, so if you look at the board, we're midway through a game here. I have my Queen of Shadow empowered, I have my pawns empowered, and I have my Bishop of Shadow empowered, okay? So right now I can move pretty much all of these, all right? My opponent has their Bishop empowered, Pawn empowered, and the King, which is here in Universal Card as one of the Universal Cards. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. If you look over here to the side, you'll see that I have some pieces that are captured that don't have cards underneath them. What that means is that when I captured that piece was defenseless, it wasn't empowered, but it generates no points. So in my move, in my next move, let's say that my queen were going to take this pawn. Well, if I did, I could take my opponent's pawn card, generate the 1 point, put the pawn here with the card underneath it. Now, obviously, I wouldn't do that because even though there's not another pawn on the board, pawns are the most popular card in the deck, okay? There are, of the 64 cards in the deck, my opponent has 16 of those cards are light pawns. So I'm not going to take that because chances are my light opponent has a pawn card there or could draw one, and then their pawn would take my queen. So that doesn't make any sense. But the move that I would make would be to move down, check the king, and take my opponent's knight. Now my opponent's knight is not empowered. My opponent's knight was defenseless. It couldn't move. So even though I take it, it gives me an advantage, and now I've checked my opponent's king, I get no points for this knight. So I didn't do a good job of describing the difference between empowered and defenseless in the last video. And hey, I'm sorry. I'm not a professional. This is my first time doing this. So I'm going to miss some things. But that was a pretty key point in order to understand the game. So now let's move forward and let's go to burns. All right. There are universal cards and then there are player cards. The primary way that you're going to get a burn is by matching one of your opponent's cards that are in play. You'd have it in your hand, you play it, you take both cards, you put it on the side, you put the piece on top of it, it would generate points. That's a burn. You can only do one burn per turn, and it's the very last phase of the turn. Remember, there was draw, use, move, burn. So once you burn that piece, the turn is over. Now let's talk about burns a little further. There is another way that you could do a burn. And that is that, let's say that I draw a card and it matches and I have both of the cards in my hand. Let's say that both of these, they're not, but both of these were the 8th pawn of, those are mine. Let's say both of these were the 8th pawn of light, okay? I could play those cards, burn the piece, and then I would draw 2 cards to replace them in my hand, okay? So you can either burn by matching a card from your hand that's in play. You can burn by drawing a card and having both cards in your hand. The other way a burn can happen is random, and it's called, we have a name for it, it's called an act of nature. What that is we're in the process of playing, this card disappears, and we draw another card, and this card happens to match my card that's in play, okay? So now there's a match that's on the board. During the next burn phase, either myself or my opponent, either one of us, can pick those 2 cards up and burn a piece. Now it's important to remember that whoever initiates the burn picks which piece is going to get burned and removed from the game. Now, you're saying to yourself, well what do you mean in my phase? Because I'm the shadow player, and if the 2 cards match, why would I burn my own piece? There are times when you may want to, as part of your strategy, burn your own piece. Let me give you some examples. Let's say that in the situation that we have right here, my opponent's king is in check, okay? Now, the opponent just happens to have the king card active, but let's say that this king card wasn't active. Let's just replace it, and let's say instead of that king, it was all shadow cards here as universal cards. So my opponent has no control over that king, okay? So he's down to the game being over. This pretty much is a checkmate because he's not going to be able to take my queen. The only way he has to prolong the game is to cycle enough cards to get their king so that the king can move forward, or the king can move, because there's no other piece that's going to be able to take that queen. It's probably just going to prolong the game a little bit, and it's probably still going to end because my queen is going to overpower him at some point. But in order to prolong the game, it may be that the light side decides, well, let me go ahead and burn one of my own cards. You'd burn your own cards because you'd get to draw two. And potentially one of those cards might be the King of Light, so that you could move and get out of checkmate. So that's one reason that you might burn your own card. The second reason is, let's say that if you look on my back row, you can see that my rook is here, and it's kind of boxed in by my knight and my pawns. I have to move forward, go up, then go over, and then I can bring my rook into play. Well, it might be that we're in the point in the game where I want to go immediately on the offensive. Either it's my queen on the back row, or it's the rook on the back row, and I want to clear my own pawn out of the path of my more powerful piece moving forward. Well, I have the option in my burn phase, provided I have the cards matching. I have two, fifth pawns. I can burn my own piece, clearing a path for my rook to move out and go on the offensive. So as part of one of the strategies in the game, if you wanted to, you could burn your own piece. Because I initiated the burn, I would pick the piece. Now, what happens is I burn my own pawn, I hand it to my opponent gets the two cards, they put it here in their little pile, and they've got a point. So I've given up a point, but it's only 1 point out of the 15-point win condition. Okay, so we've talked about burning your own cards. We've talked about an active nature. Active nature is just when a random card is put in the universal cards that matches another card that's in play. Either person, as their one burn during their turn, during that phase, can pull the cards off and burn a piece. All right, so now let's talk about, if you remember in the first video when we talked about getting 15 points, the easiest way to get to that 15 points was to burn or capture empowered pieces of the Trinity, which was the king, the queen, and the rook. So let's say that we're playing the game, and I had the King of Light in my hand, and I've now drawn the second King of Light. So I have both Kings of Light. It's my burn phase. I am going to play these two cards that generate 5 points. The Divine Right of Kings states that I can't burn the king. The king is protected as long as the king has other pieces still on the board. So I can pick any other piece that I want. Now in this game, I've already taken the queen, so the most powerful piece that I would take would probably be a rook. But let's say that the queen wasn't gone, and that the queen is here, but the queen is just not empowered, okay? And we haven't got to the point where I'm checking the king. You would say, well, why don't you take your opponent's queen? That's obviously their most powerful piece. Gives you the best chance of winning the game. But you need to think about that for a second. Because when I use the two king cards to burn and get 5 points, do I want to take a piece out of play that, had I burned it with the queen cards, was worth 4 points? Because it's only a net increase of 1. I'm going to get 5 points for the queen, whereas if I burned it the normal path of having the two queen cards, I would get 4 points. So in some cases, it might make more sense to burn a lesser valued piece. Like I might play both of these king cards and choose to burn this pawn. The reason being is I get to take the two king cards, put them to the side, take this pawn, put it on top of it. But this pawn has now generated 5 points for me of the 15. That's a third of the win condition. So in order to get to 15 points, still having the possibility of burning the queen later in the game, that's going to make it easier to achieve those 15 points. So you don't always want to burn the most powerful piece when you have your opponent's king cards, or you have one king card and their other king card is somewhere in play. So you would use it for a burn. You may want to go in between. You may want to take a 2-point knight or a 2-point bishop or a 3-point rook and have a combination of removing a powerful piece but still getting the 5 points, but not necessarily the queen. Okay? We talked about also that a lot of the rules in Trinity chess are kind of a little bit like a two-edged sword. Well, it's the same thing with the Divine Right of Kings. Now that those 2 cards are removed from the board and I've burned this pawn, there are no more king cards, King of Light cards in the deck. When that happens, the King of Light is now empowered for the rest of the game. This king doesn't need a card anymore to be able to be moved. You can move it anywhere. And I think that's it. So let me do one more thing. If you've been watching these videos, you might have seen that I was, kind of photobombed a few times. Trinity, come here, baby. Come here. Come on. Come here, sweetie. I want to introduce you because she's been in the videos anyway. Come here, sweetie. This is my baby. This is Trinity. She is a German Shepherd. She's 9 months old, which means in human years, she's roughly about 5. She might have played a little part in the naming of the game. So anyway, that's the last of my videos. Hopefully I've imparted some good information to you. Enough so that you'll want to get the game and play it. I think this game is going to be wonderful. It's going to be awesome, and I look forward to competitions and rankings and Trinity chess engines. And you know what? I have so many goals and dreams for this game. But none of these things are going to be able to happen without your help. So I want to thank you for being here. I appreciate you. Thanks for listening to me. And I'll see you in the chess game in the future. Take care and bye.